She built an empire from nothing, then watched someone inside it burn it down. Sophia Bennett had survived hostile takeovers, industry rivals, and a board that never fully believed in her. But nothing prepared her for the betrayal hiding in plain sight, inside her own executive suite. Owen Hart was supposed to be nobody. A quiet single father driving a beat-up truck on a stormy highway. No ambition, no agenda, just a man trying to get home to his daughter. Neither of them chose this. But sometimes the people who change your life most are the ones you never saw coming. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The rain came down hard enough to blur the dividing lines between the highway lanes, the kind of rain that made people pull over and wait it out. Most people, anyway. Sophia Bennett didn't pull over. She had a call scheduled for 9 o'clock, a presentation deck open on her laptop in the back seat, and 4 missed calls from her VP of Finance sitting unanswered on her phone screen. She had learned years ago that stopping, for weather, for doubt, for anything, was the first thing that separated the people who made it from the people who almost did. So she kept driving, one hand on the wheel, one eye on the rain-slicked asphalt unrolling ahead of her through the dark. The car made a sound she didn't recognize immediately. Not a bang, more like a deep thud from somewhere beneath the chassis, followed by a vibration she felt through the steering wheel and up into her palms. She frowned and pressed the accelerator slightly. The vibration grew worse. "No," she said out loud, to the car, to the rain, to the specific brand of bad timing that seemed to follow her everywhere lately. "Not tonight," the car answered by shuddering once, violently, and losing power entirely. She managed to coast the vehicle onto the gravel shoulder, where it settled at a slight angle, the hazard lights clicking to life automatically. She sat there for a moment, both hands still on the wheel, and looked through the rain-blurred windshield at the emptiness ahead. She was somewhere on Route 9, roughly 40 minutes outside the city, in a stretch of highway that connected nothing to nothing. No gas stations, no exits, no lights except the flickering orange pulse of her own hazards reflecting off the wet pavement. She picked up her phone. No signal. Sophia exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, the way her therapist had taught her to do when things went sideways. She looked at herself briefly in the rearview mirror, 30 years old, dark eyes, jaw set tight enough to ache, and said quietly, "Okay, think." She had roadside assistance through the dealership. She had a company driver she could call if she ever actually had signal. She had a briefcase full of quarterly projections and not a single useful thing for the situation she was currently in. She got out of the car. The rain hit her immediately, cold and indiscriminate. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, heels that had cost more than most people's rent, and no umbrella because she'd left it in the office 3 weeks ago and hadn't gotten around to replacing it. She walked around the car once, pointlessly, the way people do when they already know the situation is bad, but need a moment to confirm it. The front left tire was gone. Not flat. Gone. In the sense that it had separated cleanly from the rim, the rubber sitting uselessly against the wheel arch. Something in the suspension looked wrong too, though she couldn't name what specifically. She was not a mechanic. She was the CEO of Viridian Technologies, a company with 460 employees, 2 pending patents, and a merger negotiation that had kept her awake 3 nights running. None of that helped her here. She stood in the rain beside her broken car on a dark highway and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely stranded. Indeed, she heard the truck before she saw it. An older engine, slightly rough at idle, the kind of sound that came from something with real mileage on it. The headlights appeared around a long bend in the road, sweeping yellow cones across the wet asphalt, and she stepped slightly away from the car and raised one arm. The gesture felt strange. She hadn't flagged down a vehicle since she was 19 years old and hitchhiking across a country that no longer seemed relevant to who she was now. The truck slowed. It was a dark green Ford, old enough to have actual chrome on the bumper, with a dent in the passenger door that hadn't been repaired. It rolled to a stop about 20 feet past her car, and she heard the transmission shift to park before the driver's door opened. He was tall, maybe 6'1", wearing a gray Henley that was getting wet immediately and dark work pants with a smear of something, grease or paint, she couldn't tell, across the left thigh. He had the kind of face that belonged to someone who spent time outside without particularly thinking about it, not rugged in any movie poster sense, just weathered in small ways, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested either a lot of sun or a lot of tired, or both. Mid-30s, she estimated. Brown hair that the rain was already flattening against his forehead. He looked at her car first, then at her. "Blowout?" he said. "Something in the front end gave out," she said. "The tires destroyed." He walked to the front of her car and crouched down, pulling out his phone and using the flashlight to examine the wheel. He was quiet for about 15 seconds, just looking, and she noticed he didn't make any noise while he was thinking. No sucking of teeth, no low whistle, none of the performative assessment sounds she associated with men who wanted you to understand they were solving your problem. "Suspension link snapped," he said, standing up. "Probably been weak for a while. The blowout just finished it off." He looked at her. "You got roadside?" "No signal." He held up his own phone. "I've got 1 bar, sometimes enough." He dialed, waited, got through to someone, and stood in the rain having a brief, unhurried conversation about her location. She stood nearby and watched him, which felt strange. She was not accustomed to standing nearby while someone else handled a problem that belonged to her. He hung up. "Hour and a half, minimum, maybe 2. Tow truck's backed up because of weather." "Of course it is." "I can drive you into the city if you want, or there's a diner about 6 miles back that's probably still open." She looked at him. He was already soaked through, the gray Henley dark with rain across the shoulders, and he was offering this the same way someone might offer to pass the salt, without weight, without expectation, without any apparent calculation about what it might get him. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed easily. He didn't argue the point or try to make it smaller. She weighed it. She was practical, at her core, whatever else she was. Standing on a wet highway for 2 hours in heels was not practical. "City," she said, "if that's not out of your way." "It's fine." She grabbed her briefcase and laptop bag from the back seat, locked the car, which felt absurd given the circumstances but was automatic at this point, and walked to the passenger side of his truck. The door was unlocked. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and unexpectedly something like crayons. She settled into the seat, damp and slightly stiff, and he climbed in the other side and pulled back onto the highway without ceremony. Neither of them spoke for about 2 miles. "Owen Hart," he said eventually, not extending a hand since he was driving, just offering the name neutrally. "Sophia Bennett." He nodded, like this was sufficient. She looked at the dash. It was clean, not meticulously so, but organized. A small foam dinosaur on the dash that had clearly been placed there by someone much younger than him. A coffee thermos in the cup holder. A charging cable coiled neatly beside it. "You have a kid," she said, nodding toward the dinosaur. "Daughter, 7. He said it the way people say things they're proud of without wanting to make a production out of it. "She's with her grandmother tonight." "What's her name?" "Lily." Sophia looked back at the road. "That's a good name." "She chose it herself, technically. She was 4, we were reading a book, and she announced that was her name. Took us a week to stop calling her something else." Something in the way he said it. The small specificity of it, the week of adjustment, the way he clearly considered this a fine outcome, made something in Sophia's chest relax slightly, a loosening she wasn't expecting. "You live in the city?" she asked. "Borderline. Eastgate, technically. Consulting work mostly, so I can be flexible about the office piece." She turned to look at him briefly. "What kind of consulting?" "Operations, some financial restructuring, small to mid-sized companies mostly." He said it without inflation. Not what he'd done once, not what his resume said, just what he did. That covers a lot of ground. Most things do when you look at them close enough. She found herself looking at him again, more carefully this time. He was watching the road, the rain still heavy, both hands on the wheel, and there was something, she didn't have the word for it yet, something settled about him that she didn't often encounter in people her age. Most people she worked with at 30 were still moving fast, still performing slightly, still checking to make sure they were being seen. This man seemed neither concerned about being seen nor particularly avoidant of it. He was just there. "Were you heading to the city tonight?" she asked. "Before you stopped." "Hardware store," he said. "But they're closed by now." He didn't seem bothered. Lily's building something. She needs wood dowels. He paused. Tomorrow works just as well. Mshamt. They hit the city limits at 9:20, the lights coming up gradually ahead through the rain, and Sophia realized she didn't actually know where she was going. Her apartment was downtown, but she had a call at 9:15 and her laptop was in her bag, and what she actually needed was somewhere to sit and work for 2 hours while her assistant arranged a new car. "You can drop me here," she said. "Anywhere with a lobby, honestly." "There's a coffee place 2 streets over that's open until midnight," Owen said. "Good Wi-Fi if you need it." She blinked. "How do you know I need Wi-Fi?" "You've had your laptop bag on your lap since we left the highway." She looked down. He was right. She hadn't even registered doing it. He pulled over on Clement Street in front of a place called Ashwood Coffee, small lit windows, warm yellow light visible through the glass. She sat for a moment before getting out. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without performance. "I would have been standing there for 2 hours." "It was on the way," he said. She got out, then paused with the door open. "The hardware store situation. I'm sorry I kept you from it." He almost smiled, just the edge of one. "Lily's going to make do with chopsticks and rubber bands for one more night. She's resourceful." Sophia laughed. Short, real, the kind that surprised her. And then closed the door and stood on the sidewalk and watched the old truck pull away into the rain. She didn't think about him in any particular way over the following days. That's what she told herself anyway. What was actually true was that she thought about the foam dinosaur on the dash in odd moments. In the middle of a budget review, walking between meeting rooms, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office on the 14th floor, watching the city below. Not with any real focus. Just as a detail, her mind kept returning to the way the tongue returns to a small chip in a tooth. Viridian was consuming everything else. The company she'd built from a 4-person startup operating out of a converted warehouse was now, 8 years later, a legitimate player in enterprise data security. The kind of company that got mentioned in industry publications and occasionally in the business section of newspapers. They had a merger in progress with a firm called Archway Systems that would double their market footprint overnight if it closed. It was supposed to close in 6 weeks. 3 weeks after the highway, the merger started coming apart. It began with a call from Archway's lead attorney, a man named David Sue, who communicated exclusively in careful legal language that left very little room for misinterpretation. He told Sophia that certain documents Viridian had shared during due diligence had created concerns. Documents showing irregular figures in a secondary product line, figures that didn't match what Archway had been told verbally. "That's not possible," Sophia said. "I reviewed those documents personally." "I understand," David said, in the way lawyers said it when they meant the opposite of understanding, "but I need you to be aware that our client is reconsidering the timeline." She hung up and pulled the original files. The numbers were wrong, not slightly wrong, not a rounding error, not a formatting issue. Materially wrong. A secondary revenue line had been reported at $1.4 million for the previous fiscal year. The actual figure, which she knew because she had personally approved the departmental budgets, was $800,000. The discrepancy didn't make any sense unless the documents had been altered after she'd signed off. She called Marcus Webb, her head of internal operations, into her office and put the files side by side on her desk. "Explain this," she said. Marcus was 53, had been with the company for 4 years, and had the face of someone who'd learned early in life to look calm, regardless of internal weather. He looked at the documents for a long moment. "This isn't right," he said. "I know it's not right. I'm asking how." "I don't know yet." "Get me an answer by end of day." He did. Sort of. What he came back with was a trail that started clearly and then disappeared into a tangle of shared drives and access logs that had been partially wiped. Someone had gone into the document archive, modified 3 files, and replaced the originals. The access logs showed the edits had been made from an IP address registered to the office network, which narrowed it to anyone with executive-level clearance, which was 11 people. 11 people who all had reasons to want the merger to go well. Except someone didn't. The investor calls started coming the following Monday. Sophia handled the first 2 herself, controlled and clinical, because she'd been through rough quarters before, and she knew that the voice of the CEO mattered as much as the actual information conveyed. She told them there was a discrepancy under review, that it was isolated, that it would be resolved. Most of them accepted this and went away to worry quietly. The third call was from Richard Falconer, who managed a fund that held 9% of Viridian's outstanding shares, and who had, at one point, tried to acquire the company outright and been rebuffed. His version of asking questions sounded like building a case. "I'm hearing multiple concerns from the Archway side," Richard said. "Financial irregularities, process failures. I think you need to prepare for the possibility that this deal doesn't close." "I think you should hold that position until we've had a chance to complete our review," Sophia said. "And if the review takes too long, then we'll have a different conversation." She hung up and sat very still for a moment, her hands flat on her desk, and felt the specific sensation she associated with the ground becoming unstable underfoot. She'd felt it twice before in her professional life, once during a funding crisis in year 2 and once when a competitor had filed a patent challenge against their core product. Both times she'd managed, both times she'd come out of it, but both times she'd also had the advantage of knowing where the problem was coming from. She didn't know that yet. Nathan Cole knocked and opened her door simultaneously, which was a habit she'd given up trying to change. "You've seen the Archway email?" He was her business partner, technically, co-founder on paper, though he'd come in during Series A when the company was already on its feet. He was 41, well-dressed in the way of someone who understood that appearance was a professional tool, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a facility for reading a room that she'd always respected. He'd been with her for 5 years. She trusted him. "I've seen it," she said. "We need a unified position before the board call Thursday." "I know. And I think you need to consider—" He paused, visibly selecting words. "I think you need to consider whether this is the right time to step back from the merger negotiations. Let someone with distance from the situation take the lead." She looked at him. "Someone meaning you?" "Someone meaning anyone who isn't currently under scrutiny." His voice was careful, almost gentle. "It's not about blame, Sophia. It's about optics. I'm not stepping back from anything. Just think about it." "I will," she said, which was not a yes, and he knew it and left. She sat alone in her office for a long moment after he closed the door and thought about the documents, the altered files, the 11 people with access, and Nathan's very particular timing. She filed it away. The second time she saw Owen Hart, she was eating a sandwich alone on a bench in Callaway Park, which was not something she typically did, but which she had been doing lately as a form of decompression. 12 minutes away from the office, 12 minutes of something that wasn't a screen or a conference call. She'd started it as an experiment and had been doing it for 11 days. He was sitting 2 benches over, eating something out of a takeout container, with a notebook open beside him that he occasionally wrote in. He looked up, registered her, and it took him a moment, the same beat of recalibration she felt, before recognition settled on his face. "Highway," he said. "Highway," she agreed. She hesitated, then moved to the adjacent bench instead of the one 2 over. It felt less odd that way. "How's the car?" he asked. "At the dealership for 3 weeks, then back. The suspension repair was significant." She unwrapped her sandwich. "How are the wood dowels?" He blinked, then understood. She ended up using a cardboard tube from a paper towel roll, built something that was supposedly a castle but looked more like a launch pad. "Resourceful," Sophia said. "Very." They ate in parallel silence for a minute, which should have been awkward and wasn't. "You look like you're not having a great week," he said. It wasn't prying. It was observational, the same way he'd noticed her laptop bag, just naming what was visible. "I'm not," she said. She didn't intend to say more. Then, "I'm dealing with something at work that someone is making deliberately harder, and I don't know enough yet to know exactly who." He turned slightly toward her. "What kind of something?" "Corporate." She almost stopped there. "Documents were altered before a major deal, financial figures, enough to spook the other side. Someone with internal access did it." He was quiet, looking at his food, and she thought he was going to say something generically sympathetic and move on. Instead, he said, Are you tracking the access log trail or the document version history? She looked at him. Both. The logs were partially wiped. Partially is different from completely, he said. Depending on your system architecture, there's usually a secondary record in the backup protocol that doesn't get touched in a targeted wipe. Whoever did it was probably cleaning the primary logs and didn't think about the backup index. The level of specificity was unexpected enough that she stopped eating. How do you know that? Because I've seen it before. He picked up his takeout container again. Operations consulting. Sometimes that means helping companies figure out what happened after something goes wrong. Have you done that kind of forensic work? Some? She watched him, this man with the foam dinosaur and the work pants and the cardboard castle story, and felt the specific sensation of a mental category failing to hold someone. She had filed him as background, helpful stranger, highway, end of story. He was not that. My company is Viridian Technologies, she said. I know, he said. I recognized your name that night. I looked it up after. And you didn't mention it. Didn't seem relevant then. He looked at her directly for the first time in this conversation, steady and unhurried. Might be relevant now if you want it to be. She called him 3 days later. She had spent those 3 days telling herself she wouldn't, and then spent an afternoon trying to pursue the document trail through her own IT team and hitting the same walls, and then called him at 7 in the evening because she was practical, and he had offered something useful, and she was running out of options she trusted. He answered on the second ring. I want to take you up on what you mentioned in the park, she said, the backup index. I need someone outside my organization to look at it, and my instinct is that the problem is inside my organization. A pause. How many people know you're making this call? None. Good. Another pause. I can look at it. I'm not promising anything. I know. I'll need full access to the document management system, not just the files themselves. I can arrange that. And Sophia, he used her name carefully, not casually. If I find something that points to someone specific, what do you want to do with it? She had thought about this. Deal with it correctly, she said. Not quietly. Correctly. Okay, he said. Send me the system credentials. He came to the office the following Tuesday, early, before most of the staff arrived. Sophia met him in the lobby and noticed the way he took in the space, not impressed or unimpressed, just reading it, registering details the way someone does when they're building a map. He was wearing dark trousers and a collared shirt, which was a step removed from the Henley and work pants and fit the setting without looking like he was trying to fit the setting. She gave him a temporary workstation in a small conference room she trusted was not bugged, and left him with the credentials and a coffee and a direct line to her extension. He called her back at 11:43. Come look at this, he said. She closed the door behind her and stood at his shoulder and looked at the screen. He'd found the backup index and had run a comparison between it and the primary document log, and the gap between them, the actions recorded in the backup that had been scrubbed from the primary, was sitting there on the screen in plain text, time-stamped and annotated. 3 sessions, he said, over 6 weeks. Each one accessed the same cluster of files, modified numerical data in the revenue tables, and then cleared the primary log. He pointed to a column on the right side of the screen. This is the machine ID each session was initiated from. They're all different machines. Smart, she said quietly. Smart, but not thorough. The backup index records the user authentication token, not just the machine. The token is the same across all 3 sessions. He scrolled down. Whoever did this has one set of credentials and accessed from different devices, probably to make the machine ID rotation look like routine distributed access. Can you trace the credentials? Already did. He clicked to another window. Authentication token belongs to a system account. Administrative access. The account name is... He turned slightly and looked at her. You're going to want to sit down. I don't want to sit down. He turned back to the screen. The account was provisioned 5 years ago when the company migrated systems. It was registered under a co-administrator during the migration. The name on the account is Nathan Cole. The room was very quiet. Sophia stood behind him and read the name on the screen and felt something very cold and very clear move through her. Not surprise, not entirely, because something in the back of her mind had been circling this since the conversation about optics. But the confirmation of it was different than the suspicion. The confirmation had weight. "He's going to deny it," she said. Her voice was level. "Probably. But there's more." Owen scrolled further. "The session logs show activity that doesn't match the documents I've looked at. There are files in the system I haven't been given access to, financial forecasting models, internal memos from the past quarter. I think there's more here than just the document alteration." She was quiet for a moment. "How long to pull it all together?" "Give me the rest of the day." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He seemed to consider the question seriously before answering. "Because you asked me to," he said, "and because it's the right thing to do." He said it without ceremony, the way you might say it's raining or the coffee's hot, and the simplicity of it was somehow more striking than anything elaborate would have been. She left him to work and went back to her office and sat down and looked at the city outside her windows and thought about Nathan Cole, who had been at her company for 5 years, who had been present for every milestone and every setback, who had shaken her hand when the first round closed and sat beside her on the flight to the Archway preliminary meetings, and who had, apparently, been carefully and methodically building the architecture of her undoing from the inside. The board vote was in 4 days. She pulled Marcus Webb aside that afternoon, alone, away from the office, in a parking garage that was sufficiently anonymous. "I need to know if Nathan has been in contact with any board members outside of scheduled communications," she said. Marcus looked at her steadily. He was one of the 11 people with executive access. He was also one of the people she'd decided to trust, based on nothing more than instinct and 5 years of watching him operate, and she was aware of how fragile that basis was. "How specific of an answer are you looking for?" "Specific enough to know if he's been working a vote." Marcus was quiet. Then, 3 days ago, I walked past the small conference room on 16, Nathan and Richard Falconer. The door was almost closed. He paused. "I didn't hear the conversation. I kept walking." Sophia said nothing. "Sophia." His voice lowered. "What's happening?" "I'll tell you Thursday," she said, "before the board call." She went back upstairs and sat down with Owen's preliminary findings and a yellow legal pad and spent the next 3 hours building the architecture of what Thursday was going to look like. Every piece of evidence, every sequence, every person in that room and what they needed to hear and what they were predisposed to believe. She knew boardrooms. She'd built a company in them and defended it in them, and there wasn't a version of this she hadn't imagined surviving. What she hadn't imagined was that she'd be walking into the most important fight of her professional life with a single father from Eastgate who drove an old truck and whose daughter built launch pads from paper towel rolls. Owen was still at the workstation when she went back down at 5:30. He had printed nothing, which she respected. He'd kept everything digital, organized into a folder with subfolders she could navigate without help. He looked tired in the way of someone who'd been concentrating for a long time, a particular flatness around the eyes. "How bad is it?" she asked, standing in the doorway. He looked up. "Worse than you probably want it to be," he said, "but cleaner than it could be. The trail is real, and it's documented, and it points one direction." "Will it hold in a boardroom?" With the right explanation, yes. He looked at her for a moment. "Do you have someone presenting it with you?" "I was thinking just me." He was quiet. She knew what the silence meant. "Or not just me," she said. "I'll be there," he said simply. "If that's what you need." She looked at this man, this stranger who was no longer exactly a stranger, who had stopped on a dark highway in the rain and driven her to a lit coffee shop and asked nothing about it, who had sat in a park and offered specific knowledge when he didn't have to, who had spent an entire day unpicking a sabotage scheme for a company he had no stake in, and felt something shift in her chest, something that wasn't gratitude exactly, but was in the same vicinity, something warmer and more complicated. "That might be what I need," she said. He nodded and started closing windows on the screen, methodical and unhurried, and the conference room was very quiet around them, and outside the windows the city was going gold in the late afternoon light, and Sophia Bennett looked at the folder on the screen and thought about Thursday, about the boardroom, about Nathan Cole's face when the evidence appeared. She thought about the fight ahead. She thought, unexpectedly, about Lily. who built things out of whatever was available and called it a castle. And she sat down, pulled her own chair to the workstation, and got to work. Owen stayed until 7, not because she asked him to, but because there were 3 more document clusters he wanted to verify before Thursday, and he was the kind of person who finished what he started even when nobody was watching to appreciate it. Sophia learned this about him the way you learn things about people in close quarters under pressure. Not through conversation, but through observation, through the small details that accumulate into something like a portrait. He worked quietly. He didn't narrate his process or check whether she was impressed by it. When he found something significant, he flagged it and moved on. When he hit a dead end, he backed up without complaining about the detour. He drank his coffee cold without commenting on it. At one point his phone buzzed and he glanced at it. Something shifted in his face, something softer, and he sent a quick text and put it down. "Lily?" she asked. "Bedtime check-in," he said, and went back to the screen. She found herself watching him at odd moments throughout the afternoon and having to redirect herself back to her own work. It wasn't the right time for whatever that impulse was, and she knew it, and she redirected it efficiently and moved on. She was good at that. At 7, he packed up his notes, all digital, nothing printed, and stood and stretched, the kind of full-body stretch that came from hours at a desk, and said, "I'll have the full summary ready Wednesday morning. That gives you a day to read it and prepare before Thursday." "I appreciate it," she said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "How are you feeling about the board?" She thought about giving him the professional answer. Measured, confident, strategically appropriate. Instead, she said, "Like, I'm about to find out which people in that room were actually on my side." He looked at her for a moment. "That's always the useful information," he said, "even when it's not what you hoped for." She walked him to the elevator and stood in the hallway after the doors closed and thought about that sentence for the rest of the night. Wednesday arrived gray and humid, the kind of morning that made the city feel slightly compressed, like everything was closer together than it should be. Sophia was at her desk by 7, which was normal for her, but the folder Owen had sent at 6:47 was open on her screen before she'd even finished her first coffee, which was not normal for anything. She read it twice, carefully. It was not just the document alteration. That was the visible surface of it. What Owen had found underneath was something more patient and more deliberate. Over a period of roughly 8 months, Nathan had been systematically seeding doubt about Sophia's decision-making in communications with 3 board members, 2 of whom sat on the Compensation and Governance Committee, one of whom was Richard Falconer. The communications themselves weren't in writing, which was smart, but the pattern was visible in the downstream effects. Meeting minutes that reflected concerns never raised in full sessions, a governance review request filed in January that had bypassed the standard process, an agenda item for Thursday's board meeting that Sophia had not approved or been informed of. The agenda item was titled Executive Leadership Continuity Review. She sat with that phrase for a long moment. It was the kind of corporate language that meant exactly what it sounded like, while pretending to mean something procedural and neutral. Nathan wasn't just trying to tank the merger, he was trying to remove her. She picked up her phone and called Owen. He answered on the 3rd ring. She could hear ambient noise in the background, but outdoor sound, maybe a parking lot or a street. "Did you read the section on the governance committee?" she asked. "I did." "He's going for the chair." "Yes," Owen said. There was a pause. "How long do you have before the board call?" "It's an in-person meeting. Tomorrow at 9. "Then the document alteration evidence is only part of what you need. You need to be able to explain the full scope of what he's been doing, not just the files." He paused again. "Do you have anything in writing from the board members he's been working? Any emails? Anything that shows they were receiving his version of events?" "I have access to board correspondence." "Look for anything from Falconer or the governance committee in the last quarter that references your decision-making specifically, not just company performance, your decisions. If he's been running a narrative, it'll show up in how they phrase their concerns." She was already pulling up the archive on her second monitor. "I see it," she said after a minute. She'd found 3 separate emails from Falconer to the board chair in the past 8 weeks. All 3 referenced concerns about strategic alignment at the executive level. One of them used a phrase, erratic risk posture, that she had never heard attributed to her from any external analysis. It had come from somewhere internal. It had come from Nathan. He fed Falconer language, she said. Yes. She set the phone on the desk and stared at the screen. 8 months. She was reconstructing 8 months of very careful, very patient work directed entirely at dismantling her credibility from the inside, and the person doing it had sat across from her at strategy sessions and given presentations to her staff and eaten lunch with her twice a week in the executive dining room. She had told him things. She had trusted his read on people and situations because his read was usually good. Of course it was good. He'd been watching everything closely for a long time. She picked the phone back up. Owen? Yeah. How did you figure out it was him before I saw the name? What made you look at the admin account? A pause. Because the wipe was too clean for someone who just wanted to alter a file. Someone who's nervous makes a mess. Whoever did this had time, access, and a plan. That narrows the field to someone who's been comfortable in the system for years and doesn't expect to get caught. He was quiet for a moment. And the timing of the governance review request. January, 6 months into the document trail. That's not opportunistic. That's someone following a schedule. You've seen this before. Once, he said. Different industry, similar pattern. He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. I need you in that room tomorrow, she said. I know. I mean, as a witness to the evidence. Someone who can confirm the methodology of how the backup logs were recovered and interpreted. I understand, he said. I'll be there. She hung up and looked at the board correspondence and thought about Nathan Cole with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sadness. It was the cold, clarifying feeling of understanding a situation completely and knowing what needed to happen next. She didn't sleep well that night. This was not unusual when something significant was approaching, but Wednesday night was worse than typical. She lay in the dark of her apartment and ran scenarios, which was a habit she'd had since business school and had never fully unlearned. Most scenarios ended with her keeping the company. Some didn't. She played the ones that didn't several times, the way you press on a bruise to understand its edges. At 2 a.m, she got up, made tea she didn't particularly want, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the city below. Her apartment was on the 18th floor and faced west, and at this hour the city was a different version of itself. Quieter, the traffic reduced to long intervals between headlights, the lights of other apartments forming a grid that looked, from here, almost peaceful. She thought about what Owen had said in the park. Partially as different from completely. It was the kind of sentence that was about documents, and also about something else entirely. The kind of thing you said about systems, and also about people, about trust and damage, and what could still be recovered. She thought about Lily, age 7, who had apparently renamed herself and expected the world to adjust. She thought about the board meeting in 7 hours. She went back to bed at 3, slept until 5:30, and was in the office by 6:45. Nathan arrived at 8:15, which was his usual time, and came past her open office door with a cup of coffee and a nod that was exactly as normal as every other morning nod over the past 5 years. She matched it. She had decided the night before that she would give nothing away before the meeting. Not tension, not anger, not foreknowledge. What she had in the boardroom would be enough. What she showed in the hallway beforehand was none of his business. She watched him continue down the hall to his office and thought about 8 months of patience and felt something almost like professional respect for the scope of it, which was immediately followed by something much less generous. Marcus appeared at her door at 8:30. She had told him the previous afternoon, all of it, the full picture, and watched him go through the various stages of processing it in real time. Disbelief, reconstruction, a kind of quiet fury, and then finally, the same cold clarity she'd arrived at herself. Falconer will push back, Marcus said now. He was standing in the doorway with his own coffee, looking like someone who hadn't slept either. He's been invested in the narrative for months. I know. And the other 2 governance committee members will follow his lead initially. Initially, she said. That's the word I'm interested in. What does Owen present first? The backup index comparison. That's the cleanest piece. It's visual, it's time-stamped, it's unambiguous. Start with something nobody can argue with and then build on it. She had worked out the sequence until midnight. Nathan will try to characterize it as a technical anomaly. His second line will be questioning the provenance of the evidence. Who recovered it? What their qualifications are? Whether it's been handled appropriately. And Owen? He's been doing this for years. He'll be ready for that. She looked at her watch. He's coming in at 8:50. Can you meet him downstairs and bring him up the side elevator? I don't want Nathan seeing him before the room. Marcus nodded and left. She turned back to her desk and did something she almost never did, which was sit entirely still for 5 minutes. No phone, no screen, no notes. Just the room around her and the distant ambient sound of the office coming alive outside her closed door, and the particular quality of her own breathing, which was, she noted, steadier than she expected. She was ready. Okay. Owen arrived at 8:52 wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt and the same steady, unhurried quality he'd carried into every other space she'd seen him occupy. He had a laptop bag over one shoulder and looked, she thought, like someone who belonged in this building without looking like he was trying to belong anywhere. Marcus brought him directly to the small holding room adjacent to the boardroom, where Sophia was waiting. "How are you doing?" Owen asked her. "Fine," she said, and it was almost true. He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at things, assessing without judgment. "You've been through hard rooms before," he said. "Every one of them felt like this one right beforehand. And you came out of every one of them. So far." Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "That's the only record that matters." They went through the structure of the presentation one more time, quickly and without drama. He would present the technical findings first. She would follow with the context, the governance review, the Falconer correspondence, the full 8-month pattern. If Nathan challenged the methodology, Owen would address it directly. If Falconer challenged the relevance, she would read him his own emails back. "One more thing," Owen said, looking at her. "When Nathan responds, and he will, loudly, probably, don't respond to the emotion. Respond to the substance. Let him be the one raising his voice." "I know how to run a boardroom," she said. "I know you do," he said, without apology. "I'm saying it anyway because it's worth saying." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Fair enough." The board of directors of Viridian Technologies was composed of 7 people. 3 were independent members. 1 was Richard Falconer, representing his fund. 2 were internal, Sophia and Nathan. The 7th was Eleanor Park, the board chair, a woman in her mid-60s who had built and sold 2 companies of her own and who held the position with the specific authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. They filed in at 9 exactly. Sophia had learned over the years to read a boardroom by the way people sat down, who chose the seats nearest the chair, who positioned themselves for exit, who made eye contact and who avoided it. This morning, Richard Falconer sat at Eleanor's right, which was deliberate, and he looked at Sophia with the pleasant, neutral expression of someone who had already decided what was happening today. Nathan sat across from her, 3 seats down, and opened a leather portfolio and clicked his pen and did not look up. Eleanor opened the session with the standard agenda review and then paused. "We have a matter raised by Ms. Bennett that she's indicated requires priority consideration before we move to scheduled items." She looked at Sophia. "The floor is yours." Sophia stood. "Thank you, Eleanor. Before I begin, I've asked Owen Hart, an independent forensic operations consultant, to present findings from a review of Viridian's document management system." "Mr. Hart." Owen stood at the far end of the table and connected his laptop to the room's display without preamble or introduction beyond his name. The first slide was the backup index comparison. 2 columns, the primary log and the backup index, with the discrepancies highlighted in a color that was visible even from the far end of the room. He walked through it methodically. 3 sessions, 6 weeks, matching authentication tokens across different machines, the connection to the altered financial documents submitted to Archway Systems. He didn't editorialize, he didn't frame. He put the data on the screen and explained what it showed in plain language and then stopped talking. The room was quiet. Falconer was the first to speak. "What's the source of this data? Who authorized access to internal system logs?" "I did," Sophia said, "as chief executive." "For an external party?" "For an independent reviewer, yes, which is within my authority." She didn't wait for his follow-up. Mr. Hart, can you speak to the integrity of the extraction process? Owen addressed the methodology question for 2 minutes, the same way he'd addressed everything else, without drama, without defensiveness, with enough technical specificity to make it clear that the process had been clean and that challenging it would require a level of technical knowledge none of the board members present currently had. Falconer's expression shifted subtly. He was recalibrating. Nathan hadn't spoken yet. Sophia moved to the second part. She pulled up the governance review request. The dates? The board correspondence? She read 2 passages from Falconer's emails, not unkindly, just factually. The phrase erratic risk posture, the phrase strategic alignment concerns, both of which she noted were absent from every external performance review and investor communication in Viridian's history, and both of which had appeared in board communications immediately following private meetings between Nathan Cole and Richard Falconer. Falconer said, "Those communications reflect genuine—" "Richard," Eleanor said quietly. Just the name. He stopped. Nathan looked up for the first time. His face was doing something complicated, the first visible sign of the controlled exterior cracking, which Sophia noted and filed without satisfaction. "This is a mischaracterization," Nathan said. His voice was level, which cost him something. She could see the cost. "The system records are ambiguous. An external reviewer can frame data to support whatever narrative the person who hired them is pursuing." "That's a specific accusation," Eleanor said, looking at Owen. "It is," Owen said, "and I'd welcome a second independent review of the same data. The extraction is documented and reproducible. If the board wants to commission a parallel analysis, the results will be identical." He looked at Nathan. "The authentication token is what it is. It was provisioned under your name. The sessions happened during business hours from devices registered to this building." Nathan opened his mouth. Owen continued without raising his voice. "I'm not presenting a theory. I'm presenting a record. If there's an alternate explanation for how your authentication credentials appeared in 3 separate document modification sessions, we're all listening." The room was very still. Nathan's jaw tightened. He looked at Sophia. Something in his expression was no longer controlled in the same way. There was something raw underneath it, and she realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that part of what she was seeing was not just exposure, but something almost like relief, the specific release of a person who has been maintaining a long lie and now no longer has to. He didn't offer an alternate explanation. Falconer said quietly, "Eleanor, I think we need to recess." "We need no such thing," Eleanor said. She was looking at Nathan with the expression of someone who had built 2 companies and knew exactly what a betrayal looked like when she saw it. "Nathan, do you have anything substantive to add?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. "I'd like to speak with legal counsel before I respond to any of this formally," Nathan said. Which was, Sophia knew, an answer. Eleanor looked around the table once, a slow, full circuit, and then said, "I think we all understand what that means." She made a note in the folder in front of her. "The leadership continuity review item is removed from today's agenda. We'll take a 20-minute recess and reconvene to address the archway situation and the path forward with full confidence in current leadership." She looked at Richard Falconer when she said the last part. Falconer said nothing. He was looking at his own notes as if they contained something very interesting. Sophia stood and walked to the water table at the side of the room, and Owen came to stand beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city went about its morning indifferently. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary machinery of a day that had no idea what had just happened in this room. "You were right," she said quietly, "about not responding to the emotion." "I know," he said. He poured himself a glass of water. "He was expecting you to get angry." "I noticed." "You didn't." "No." She looked at the room behind them, at the board members in low conversation, at Nathan Cole sitting at the table with his leather portfolio closed and his hands flat on it. He underestimated how long I've been waiting for this. Owen was quiet for a moment. "What happens to him now?" "Legal review. Probably termination today, investigation after." She paused. "He'll face real consequences, depending on what the investigation finds, potentially criminal ones." "And the merger?" Archway's attorney has been aware that we're conducting an internal review. Once I can demonstrate the source of the altered documents and that it was deliberate sabotage rather than organizational negligence, the deal has a basis for reopening. She picked up her own water glass. It won't be simple, but it has a path. Owen nodded. He was looking out the window at the city below, and she had the sense that he was thinking about something other than the boardroom, though she couldn't have said what. "Owen," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know how to fully thank you for this," she said. She meant it without sentimentality, which was the only way she could really mean things. "What you found, what you came in here and presented today, that was my company. 8 years of work. And without what you did this week, I was going to lose it." He looked at her steadily. "You weren't going to lose it. You were already looking in the right direction when you called me. Maybe. You knew something was wrong with the documents on the first day. You knew it was internal. You were already narrowing the field." He paused. "I just knew where to look." She thought about arguing the point and decided it was more useful to take the compliment the way it was offered, without inflation on either side. "What do you do now?" she asked. "After this?" "Go home," he said. "Lily's making pasta tonight. She's been practicing." He said it with this particular dry warmth of a parent describing something they consider both ridiculous and wonderful. She's very serious about it. The image of it, this man with his complicated, quietly remarkable history, going home to a 7-year-old who was serious about pasta, did something to the tension in Sophia's chest that 2 glasses of water and 20 minutes of debrief hadn't managed. "How is she?" Sophia asked. "Generally." He looked at her briefly, and something in his face acknowledged the question as slightly larger than it appeared. "She's good," he said. "She's a lot more okay than I probably give her credit for being. Kids usually are." "Yeah." He looked back at the window. "It took me a while to believe that." She wanted to ask what a while meant, how long the hard part had been, what it looked like to be on the other side of it. She didn't, because the recess was ending, and Eleanor Park was returning to her seat, and the room was reorganizing itself for the second half of a meeting that was going to require her complete attention. But she filed the question somewhere she could find it later. The reconvened session lasted 90 minutes. Nathan Cole left the room at the recess and did not return. His attorney arrived in the building at 11:15, and by noon an emergency HR process was underway that would result by end of day in a formal suspension pending investigation. 3 board members who had been positioned as recently as yesterday to support the leadership review vote shifted their positions entirely. Falconer was quieter than she had ever seen him in a board setting, which she interpreted correctly as someone recalibrating their relationship to a situation they had nearly gotten badly wrong. Eleanor Park, for her part, moved through the remainder of the meeting with the efficiency of someone who had seen this kind of thing before and knew that the way to handle it was to get back to work immediately. "The Archway situation," she said, when they reached it on the agenda. "What's the current status and what do we need to do?" Sophia walked them through it, the documented source of the altered figures, the communication she would send to David Sue and Archway's executive team today, the timeline for a corrected due diligence package, the basis for requesting a 30-day extension to the merger closing period, which Archway's counsel had already, informally, indicated they would consider. "You're confident in the path forward?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," Sophia said, not because everything was certain, but because certainty wasn't the metric. She was confident in the work, in the documentation, in her ability to make the case. That was what confidence actually meant. It won't be without friction, but the deal has substance on both sides and both parties know it. The disruption was manufactured. Once Archway understands that, the fundamentals reassert themselves. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone measuring something. "Good," she said. The meeting ended at 12:30. Sophia sat in the boardroom after the others had filed out, alone for the first time since 7 that morning. The room had the particular post-meeting quality of a space where something significant had just happened, and the air hadn't quite settled yet. She looked at the empty chair where Nathan had sat, and then looked away from it. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Owen, who had left at the end of the first session and was presumably halfway to wherever he was going. It held. They moved. "Archway conversation starts today. Thank you." His reply came back 4 minutes later. Good. Go eat something. You look like you forgot to this week. She laughed, alone in an empty boardroom, and it was the realest thing she'd felt in 3 days. She went and found her lunch, knits. The days after were not quiet, but they were ordered, which was different. Ordered she could work with. The Archway communication went out Thursday afternoon. David Sue called Friday morning earlier than she expected, which she took as a sign that the explanation had landed. He was careful in the way lawyers were always careful, but the temperature of the conversation was different, less defensive, less adversarial. Archway wanted the deal. They had always wanted the deal. What they had not wanted was uncertainty about who they were getting into business with. And what the week's events had established, paradoxically, was exactly who Sophia Bennett was under pressure. She told David she would have a corrected documentation package by the following Wednesday. He said they would reconvene the following Friday. Marcus, who had been holding the operations side together through the entire week with the steady efficiency of someone you didn't fully appreciate until the crisis proved it, came into her office Friday afternoon and sat down without being invited, which was how she knew he needed to actually talk. "How are you doing?" he said. "Not the company. You." She considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." Nathan's attorney has been in contact with HR. He's going to dispute the suspension. He can dispute it. The documentation doesn't dispute. I know. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about the length of it. 8 months. That's not someone who snapped or made a bad decision under pressure. That's someone who looked at you across the table every week for 8 months. I know, Sophia said. Does it... He stopped. Does it what? Change how you trust people. She looked at the city outside her windows, the answer sitting somewhere between the obvious one and the true one. It changes the timeline, she said finally. How long before you actually know someone? She paused. I thought I knew him. You knew who he wanted you to see. That's almost the same thing and completely different. Marcus nodded slowly. What about Owen Hart? He said, neutral in the way that meant the question was not entirely neutral. What happens with him now? She picked up her pen and set it down. I don't know yet, she said. That also asked me in a week. He accepted this and stood to leave, and at the door he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, he handled himself well in that room. Very well. I know, she said. After Marcus left, she sat for a while with the city and the late afternoon light, which had turned the glass buildings across the way into something briefly golden, and thought about the week that had just happened and the week before it, and the stormy highway that had started all of it, which felt, from here, like something from a different era, even though it was less than 2 months ago. She thought about a man who knew where the backup index was and how the authentication tokens worked, and also knew how to sit very still beside a 7-year-old who had been through things no 7-year-old should go through and come out of it with someone who renamed herself and built things from what was available. She had, she realized, been thinking about Lily almost as much as she'd been thinking about Owen. That was worth paying attention to. She packed up her desk at 6:15 and took the elevator down and walked out of the building into an evening that was cooler than the day had been, the city exhaling after the heat. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started moving. She had a company to save. She was already, quietly, saving it. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she didn't feel like she was doing it alone. The corrected documentation package went to Archway on Wednesday, as promised. Sophia had spent the better part of 3 days rebuilding it from the ground up. Not just correcting the altered figures, but documenting every number's origin, every projection's methodology, every assumption embedded in the financial models. It was more work than the original package had required, and it was also, she knew, the stronger version. The crisis had forced a thoroughness that the original timeline hadn't allowed for. She sent it at 11:47 Wednesday night, and was asleep by 1, which counted as early by the standards of the past 2 weeks. David Sue called Friday morning at 9:15, which was 15 minutes after their scheduled time, and she spent those 15 minutes doing nothing in particular and not checking her phone, which required more effort than she would have admitted to anyone. The documentation is comprehensive, David said when he finally called. Our client's position has shifted. He paused, selecting words the way lawyers always did. There are still questions about organizational stability in light of the recent leadership changes, but the fundamental financial picture is sound and the proprietary concerns from the due diligence review have been addressed. What does your client need to move forward? She asked. A 30-day extension to the closing timeline, and a direct conversation between Ms. Bennett and Archway's CEO before the end of next week. I can do that, she said. She hung up and sat with her hands flat on her desk and let herself feel something close to relief, which she had been not allowing herself to feel for 2 weeks, because relief before the thing was actually resolved was a liability. Now it arrived, briefly and without fanfare, and she acknowledged it and moved on. She texted Owen. Archway's moving again. 30-day extension, direct CEO call next week. His reply came back while she was already pulling up the next item on her list. Good news. How's the rest of it? She looked at the question and typed back, ask me in person. There was a pause, longer than his usual response time. Then, Saturday morning work? Lily has a thing in the afternoon, but the morning's free. She typed, yes. She met them at a place called Birchwood, a neighborhood cafe in Eastgate that Owen had suggested. It was the kind of place that had been open for 20 years and showed it. The tables didn't all match. The menu was handwritten on a board that had been updated so many times the original chalk colors were indistinguishable, and the coffee was genuinely good in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetic effort. She arrived 5 minutes early and took a corner table and watched the door. Owen came in at 10:05, with Lily slightly ahead of him, which seemed to be the natural order of things. Lily was 7 and looked it, small, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail that was already coming partially loose, wearing jeans and a yellow shirt with a small iron-on patch of a rocket ship on the sleeve, which Sophia noticed immediately. She had the specific energy of a child who was comfortable in her body and had opinions about things. She also stopped dead when she saw Sophia, which was not hostile exactly, but was very direct. Owen said, Lily, this is Sophia. She's a friend. Lily looked at Sophia for a long, assessing moment that contained more information than most adult evaluations Sophia had ever undergone. You look like you work a lot, Lily said. Sophia blinked. I do work a lot. My dad works a lot too, Lily said, apparently satisfied, and climbed into the chair across from Sophia and picked up a laminated menu she clearly didn't need. Owen sat down and looked at Sophia with an expression that was half apology and half something else. She's at a very observational stage, he said. I heard that, Lily said, not looking up from the menu. I know, Owen said. Sophia found herself suppressing a smile that felt genuine and uncomplicated, which was not the kind of smile she produced very often. They ordered coffee for the adults, hot chocolate and a waffle with fruit for Lily, who specified the fruit arrangement to the server with polite gravity. When the server left, Owen looked at Sophia properly for the first time since she'd arrived, and she saw that he looked rested in a way he hadn't looked all week, which made sense. He'd slept. She probably hadn't, not really, but she'd checked this morning, better than she felt. Archway call is next Thursday, she said, with their CEO directly. David Sue framed it as a formality, which means it's not a formality, but it's also not the obstacle it could have been 2 weeks ago. Who's their CEO? Paul Vance. I've met him twice. He's direct, which I can work with. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The governance committee is in a different position than they were. Eleanor has been present in the way she gets present when something's been handled wrong, and she's recalibrating. What about Falconer? Quieter than I've ever seen him. She paused. I don't think he knew the full scope of what Nathan was doing. I think he was receiving a curated version and using it because it aligned with things he already believed. Doesn't make him innocent. No, but it makes him recoverable. She looked at her coffee. The investigation has been going for a week. HR and legal, plus an external firm. They've found additional things. Owen was watching her. What kind of additional things? Financial. Nathan appears to have been in preliminary conversations with a competitor about proprietary information. Nothing confirmed yet, but the email trail is suggestive. She said it flatly, the way you said things when you'd already processed the emotional portion and moved into the practical. If it's confirmed, it's not just an employment matter. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "How are you, actually?" It was the same question Marcus had asked, and she gave a different answer this time because a week had passed and because Owen asking it felt like a different kind of question. "I'm functional," she said. "I'm running well on about 70%, and the other 30% I'm borrowing from later. That's honest." "You asked." Lily, who had apparently been listening while appearing not to, said, without looking up, "My dad does that too. He calls it the tab." Owen looked at his daughter. "That's a private expression." "I'm just explaining it," Lily said. Sophia looked at Owen. "The tab," she said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's a thing I said once, about how sometimes you run the energy you're going to need later because the present requires it, and at some point you have to settle up." He looked mildly uncomfortable about having this explained in front of him. "It's not a very sophisticated concept." "It's exactly right," Sophia said. He looked at her. "Feeling like the tab's getting long?" "Feeling like I don't know what settling up looks like yet," she said. "I've been in crisis mode for so long the baseline feels unfamiliar." The waffle arrived. Lily inspected the fruit arrangement, found it acceptable, and began eating with the focused methodology of a person who had strong feelings about the correct sequence of foods. Owen watched her for a moment with the particular expression parents wore when they were observing their children doing something ordinary, not sentimental, just attentive, like they were committing it to somewhere deeper than memory. Sophia watched him watching Lily, and something in the image settled into her awareness with more weight than she was ready for. She looked away. They stayed at Birchwood for 2 hours, which was longer than any of them had mentioned planning to. The conversation moved in the way of conversations between people who are still learning the shape of each other. Not linearly, but by association and tangent, covering ground in no particular order. She learned that Owen had grown up in Ohio, the second of 3 boys, in a family where the practical was valued over the decorative in ways that had formed him and occasionally chafed him. She learned that he'd started his first company at 26 with 2 partners, grown it to 50 employees over 4 years, and sold it at 30, and that the sale had been a financial success and a personal one in the sense of confirming something he'd needed confirmed about his own capability, which was that he had it. She learned, in the way you learn things when they're offered carefully and not all at once, that his wife's name had been Cora. It came up because Lily said something. Mama liked waffles, too. In the same tone she used for all statements of fact, unprefaced and unsentimental in the way children sometimes were about large things, and Owen said she did, without looking away from his coffee, and the table held it for a moment before moving on. Sophia didn't press. She recognized the particular texture of a subject that was present and owned but not available for general handling. She had her own version of those. What she did say later, when Lily had gone to the counter to return her hot chocolate mug with the seriousness of someone completing a formal procedure, was, "She seems genuinely okay." Owen looked up. He knew what she meant. "Yeah," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "She wasn't for a while. She was 4 when Cora died, so she doesn't have complete memories. She has impressions, which in some ways made it harder because she couldn't fully understand what was gone, just that something was." He set his coffee down. "She went through a stretch where she didn't talk much. Not a clinical thing, she just went internal. For about 6 months. What changed? She found things she wanted to make," he said. "The building stuff. And she got mad one day about something completely unrelated. I think I gave her the wrong cereal. And the mad just broke through and she's been talking ever since." He paused. "I was more relieved about the cereal argument than I've been about most things in my professional life." Sophia looked at him. She named herself. 2 months after she started talking again, he said. "I don't know if it was connected, but the timing is what it is." Lily came back and climbed into her chair and announced they needed to leave by 12:15 because her Saturday afternoon thing started at 1, and she needed to change her shirt, which was non-negotiable. "What's the thing?" Sophia asked her. "Building club," Lily said. "We're making a bridge that can hold weight. Mine is going to hold the most." "How do you know?" Lily looked at her with the expression of someone who considered this a genuinely unnecessary question. "Because I practiced," she said. Owen caught Sophia's eye over Lily's head, and this time he did smile, not the edge of one, a real one, and it did something to the room that Sophia was not going to think about right now. They walked out together onto the Saturday morning street, the Eastgate neighborhood going about its weekend business around them. A farmer's market 2 blocks over, the distant sound of a youth soccer game from somewhere in the park, a quality of light that belonged specifically to late spring mornings in cities where people still lived at street level. Lily walked ahead to look at something in a shop window. "Thank you for today," Sophia said. Owen was watching Lily. She was fine with it, if that's what you're wondering. "It was one of the things I was wondering." He looked at her sideways. "What were the others?" She thought about how to answer that honestly without saying too much too soon, because she was good at knowing when too soon was too soon. Whether this was just professional courtesy, she said, meeting like this. He was quiet for a moment. He was, she had learned, a person who didn't speak to fill silence. "No," he said, "it's not just professional courtesy." It was a simple sentence. It didn't come with an addendum or a qualification or a follow-up that softened it. He said it, and it sat there, and she let it sit there and didn't say anything in return, because sometimes the right response to a simple, true thing was just to receive it. Lily turned around from the shop window and called, "Dad, they have the paint pens in the good colors." "We're not buying paint pens today," he said. "I'm not asking you to buy them. I'm informing you they exist." "I am informed," he said. Sophia laughed, and Owen looked at her, and for a moment the three of them stood on the Saturday sidewalk in the Eastgate morning light, and nothing about it felt like what it was, which was the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, and neither of them, she thought, was going to be able to stop. The next 3 weeks had a different quality than the 3 before them. The crisis was not over. It had extended routes she was still finding, but the acute phase had passed, and what remained was recovery work, which required a different kind of stamina. Sophia was better at emergency operations than she was at the long, undramatic grind of rebuilding, but she was not bad at the grind, and she knew how to pace herself through it. The Archway call with Paul Vance went as well as anything had gone in a while. He was, as she'd said, direct, and he asked her one question she hadn't fully anticipated, which was, "What failed in your internal oversight that allowed this to happen for 8 months?" And she gave him the true answer, which was that her trust in her co-founder had created a blind spot she hadn't had the structure to compensate for. He respected the honesty enough to say so, which she respected in return. The 30-day extension held. The merger conversation moved forward on a revised timeline. Nathan's investigation produced the suspected evidence of competitive contact, 3 emails and a preliminary meeting with a firm called Corten Analytics that competed directly with Viridian in the enterprise security space. The content of the emails was specific enough that HR moved from suspension to termination, and the external law firm issued findings that were forwarded to state attorneys for review. Nathan retained counsel and went quiet, which was not the same as going away, but it was, for now, sufficient. Sophia came into the office one morning and found that the absence of his name on the executive floor directory had already been processed, just a blank space where the nameplate had been. She looked at it for a moment and went to her own office and started the day. Through all of it, she and Owen talked, not constantly, not in the way of people who had formalized something and were performing the maintenance of it, but regularly and with increasing ease. Texts during the workday, calls on evenings when Lily was asleep, and he had the specific free-float quality of a parent with a quiet house. Twice more in person. Once a quick coffee near her office, once dinner at a small Italian place where the food took a long time and neither of them minded. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about people who were careful with information, not out of deception, but out of a genuine sense that information should be earned before it was offered. She learned that he'd walked away from his company, not cleanly but messily, that the year after Cora died had included a period where he made decisions he wasn't proud of, professional and personal, and that the consulting work was partly what he'd built in the aftermath of clearing the debris. He said this without self-pity and without excessive analysis, which she found easier to receive than either would have been. She told him things in return. About the years before Viridian, the ones that had formed her in ways she didn't always acknowledge. A family with money and expectations, and a specific version of success they'd been disappointed she hadn't pursued. About the founding of the company, which had been motivated partly by genuine vision and partly by a need to prove something to people who probably didn't deserve the energy. About the loneliness of the CEO position, which was structural and not personal, the way it put you on one side of a glass from everyone who worked for you, no matter how much you wanted otherwise. He listened to all of it without trying to fix it. She noticed that. She noticed it because most people, when you told them something hard, wanted to hand you a solution or a reframe or a better way of looking at it. Owen just listened until you were done and then responded to what you'd actually said, not to the version of it he could resolve more easily. It was, she thought, one of the more unusual qualities she'd encountered in a person. The thing that shifted the center of gravity between them happened on a Thursday evening, unremarkably. She was working late, routine by her standards, and had been on a call with Marcus and the external investigation firm for 2 hours, and was tired in the specific way of someone whose brain had been running at full capacity and needed to stop. She was sitting at her desk at 8:30, looking at a document she was no longer fully processing when her phone rang. "Owen." "I know it's late," he said when she answered. "It's fine. I'm still here." I figured. She could hear in the background the specific quiet of an Eastgate evening, not silent but contained. "Lily made pasta again tonight. She said to tell you it was better than last time." Sophia felt something genuinely warm move through the center of her chest. "She said to tell me specifically?" "She asked if I was going to talk to you tonight, and when I said maybe, she said, 'Tell her the pasta was better.'" "So," a pause. "The pasta was better." Sophia leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. What did she improve? Less salt, and she let it boil longer. She was very serious about the boiling time. "That's the right instinct." "You cook?" "I used to." She looked at the city outside her window, dark now except for the lights. "I stopped having the time somewhere around year 4 of the company. I eat well, I just don't make it." She paused. "I miss it sometimes. There's something about cooking that's mechanical in a useful way. You follow steps and the thing happens. Unlike most things. Unlike most things." She was quiet for a moment. "Owen." "Yeah. Do you ever think about what your life looks like from the outside? Like if you described it to someone who didn't know you?" He considered this. "Sometimes." "Why?" "I was thinking about how I would have described you if someone had asked me 6 weeks ago, after the highway, but before everything else. I would have said, single father, small consulting business, drives an old truck, seems like he has his head on right." She paused. "And now I know that description is accurate, and also almost completely beside the point." He was quiet on the other end of the line. "You were the most important person in the room that day," she said. "In the boardroom. Not because of the evidence, though the evidence was what saved the deal, but because you were the only person in there who didn't want anything from the outcome except the right thing to happen." "I wanted you to win," he said. "That's different from wanting something from you." "Yeah," he said. "It is." Another silence, the comfortable kind. "How's Lily with this?" Sophia asked. "With you talking to someone. She's perceptive enough that she's noticed." "She noticed a while ago," he said. "She doesn't have a vocabulary for what to do with it yet, but she's watching." "Is that hard for her?" He thought about it honestly. "I think she's deciding whether to be okay with it," he said. "She does that. She doesn't react to things immediately. She goes away and considers and then comes back with a position." He paused. "She came back with a position on you being at breakfast last Saturday." "What was the position?" "She said you were smart and you didn't talk down to her," he said, "which is high praise. I'm taking it as such." "You should." She heard him exhale, slow. "Sophia, I want to be honest with you about something." "Okay." "I've been careful," he said. "With Lily, with everything, since Cora. Not because I decided to be, just because it happened and it was easier than the alternative, and at some point careful became the default." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I noticed that it's less of a default lately, and I think you should know I noticed that." She sat very still at her desk. The city glittered outside the window. "I hear you," she said. "I'm not telling you I know what it means yet." "I know. I just think you should know it." "I do know it," she said. "And for what it's worth, I'm careful too. Different reasons, same result." She looked at the document on her screen without seeing it. I've been thinking about coming to Eastgate again. Saturday, he said, if you want. Lily's bridge project has moved to phase 2, apparently. Does she know how many people are rooting for the bridge? She would find that information appropriate, he said. She expects to be rooted for. Sophia laughed, and it was the honest kind, the kind that didn't require any management. Saturday, she said. Yes, Bob. She came on Saturday, and the bridge was a 3-span design built from balsa wood and craft wire, and a meticulous amount of considered geometry spread across the kitchen table with a ruler beside it, and 3 reference drawings Lily had made herself in her notebook. Sophia stood over it for a long moment, genuinely impressed and trying to express it without being condescending about it. The triangulation on the support structure, she said. Did you figure that out yourself? Lily looked up from the notebook with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right question. Triangles don't bend, she said. Squares bend. If you use triangles for the support, it stays stiff under weight. Where did you learn that? YouTube and my dad. She glanced at Owen. He said the triangle thing, and then I looked up why, and now I know more about it than he does. Owen, from the kitchen where he was making coffee, said, That's an exaggeration. It's mostly accurate, Lily said to Sophia, in the tone of a reasonable adult being fair. Sophia sat down at the table across from the bridge and looked at it properly. It was genuinely well constructed, better than most children's projects she'd seen or could remember seeing, which she attributed equally to the applied geometry and the kind of focused attention that produced things that worked rather than things that looked like they should work. Is it going to hold the most weight at building club? She asked. Lily looked at the bridge with the assessment of someone who had done the math. Yes, she said. The second place one is Jamie's, and Jamie doesn't trust triangles. He uses rectangles. His bridge will look better, but mine will carry more. Function over aesthetics. Lily seemed to consider whether she agreed with this framing. I want mine to look good too, she said. But the weight has to work first. Everything else is secondary. Sophia looked at the 7-year-old who had named herself and built things and had opinions about structural integrity and thought about Owen saying she decides whether to be okay with things and then comes back with a position, and she felt something move in her chest that was specific and complicated and had nothing to do with merger timelines or board votes. She looked up to find Owen in the kitchen doorway, coffee in each hand, watching them both. He didn't say anything. He brought the coffee to the table and set one in front of her and went to stand beside Lily and asked her something about the anchor points. And Lily launched into an explanation, and the Saturday morning moved around them the way mornings did, normally, unremarkably, with the specific texture of people who were learning how to be in the same space. The investigation findings came out on a Tuesday, full and formal, 3 weeks after the internal review had begun. Nathan Cole was terminated for cause. The findings documented the document alteration, the board manipulation campaign, and the competitive contact. The state attorney's office confirmed they were reviewing the materials. The law firm's conclusion used language like systematic breach of fiduciary duty and deliberate bad faith, which were the kinds of phrases that had real legal weight and also the weight of plain truth. Sophia read the full report in her office with the door closed and thought about 5 years of lunches in the executive dining room and let herself feel angry about it for exactly 15 minutes, which was what she had. Then she sent it to Marcus and Eleanor and picked up the phone and called Paul Vance at Archway. The investigation's complete, she said. I'm sending you the summary now. I've heard preliminary, Vance said. It's significant. It is, but it's also complete, meaning it's behind us. A pause. You're ready to move. I've been ready to move, she said. I've been waiting for the documentation to match the readiness. Vance was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was deciding something. Then, let's close this out, he said. My team will be in contact this week. She hung up and let herself sit with that for a moment. The particular quality of momentum after a long standstill, a thing in motion that had been still for too long. Marcus knocked and opened the door. He looked at her face and understood. Archway's moving? Yes, he exhaled. How close? Close enough that I need the merger working group back together this week. She was already writing. And I need the revised integration timeline from finance. I'll have it by end of day. Marcus. She looked up. You held this together when I was watching the boardroom and the investigation at the same time. That mattered. He looked at her with the expression of someone who didn't need the recognition but received it anyway, with grace. That's the job, he said. The job and the person aren't the same thing. He nodded and left, and she turned back to her desk. She had a company to close a merger for. She had a board to brief. She had an investigation summary to formally file, and a communications plan to approve, and an all-hands meeting to schedule for the following week. She had a Saturday, 2 days out, when a 7-year-old was going to find out whether her bridge held. She hoped it did. She realized, genuinely invested in the outcome, which was not the kind of thing she would have predicted about herself 4 months ago. Standing in the rain on a dark highway, stranded, alone, certain that stopping was for other people. She thought about what Owen had said that first night at the cafe, with a simplicity that had stayed with her. Sometimes the people who change your life most are the ones you never saw coming. She hadn't known then that he was talking about himself. She was starting to understand it now. Lily's bridge held 412 grams before anything moved, and what moved first was not a structural failure, but a single anchor wire that had been slightly under-tensioned on the left span. The bridge itself held. The wire slipped. Lily noted this distinction to the building club moderator with the precision of someone who intended the record to reflect accurately what had failed and what had not. She won anyway. Jamie's bridge collapsed at 280. Owen told Sophia about it on the phone that evening, and she could hear in his voice the specific quality of pride that tried not to sound like pride and didn't quite succeed. She made the moderator write down that the bridge structure was intact, he said. She wanted it on the record. Good for her, Sophia said, and meant it entirely. She also said to tell you. Sophia was sitting at her kitchen counter with a glass of water and the merger integration timeline open on her laptop, and she closed the laptop. Tell her I said well done. Tell her the triangles worked. I will. A pause. How's the integration timeline? Complicated, but moving. She rubbed the back of her neck. Finance and operations have different assumptions built into their models, and reconciling them is taking longer than it should. We have a joint working session tomorrow with the Archway team, and I need the two sides speaking the same language before we walk in. What's the core disagreement? Revenue recognition on the enterprise contracts. Archway books differently than we do, and the combined entity needs a unified methodology, and both sides think their methodology is correct because both sides are used to their own system. Owen was quiet for a moment. Is it a principles disagreement or a practical one? What do you mean? I mean, do they actually think their method is more accurate, or do they think their method is more convenient, and they've been using it long enough that it feels like truth? She sat with that. The second one, she said after a moment. Almost certainly the second one. Then the conversation isn't about methodology. It's about getting both sides to admit that their system is familiar, not superior, and that a unified system benefits everyone even if it requires adjustment. He paused. Which is a different conversation than the one you've been having. She looked at the wall of her kitchen for a moment. You're right, she said. We've been having a technical argument about a preference issue. Yeah, that's a useful reframe. You would have gotten there, he said. Probably, tomorrow morning before the meeting. She picked up the water glass. Owen. Yeah. Well, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the answer is complicated. A pause. Okay. What are we doing? The question sat on the line between them for a moment. She hadn't planned to ask it tonight. It had surfaced the way honest questions sometimes did, through the accumulated weight of all the smaller ones she hadn't asked. I think we're figuring that out, he said. That's not a non-answer, but it's close. I know. He was quiet, and she could hear that he was taking it seriously, not deflecting. What I know is that I want to figure it out. I haven't been in a position where I wanted to figure something like this out in a long time. He said it carefully, the way he said things that had weight. And I know it's not simple because of Lily, and it's not simple because of your life, and I'm not someone who pretends complicated things are straightforward. Neither am I. Then we're probably compatible on that. She was quiet for a moment. Lily told me her bridge was going to hold. She didn't say it would probably hold. She said it would. Yes. I respected that. The confidence without the bravado. She's had to learn that things can be both uncertain and worth building, Owen said. She doesn't always have the words for it, but she has the instinct. Sophia looked at the city outside her kitchen window, the lights familiar and various. I'm going to win the Archway meeting tomorrow, she said. I know. And after it, I want to see you both. Not a plan. Just whatever Saturday is, whatever Lily's building. She's moved on to a pulley system, he said. Phase 2 of a larger project. I'll be there, Sophia said. She hung up and opened the laptop again and looked at the integration timeline with new eyes, and rewrote the framing for the next day's session in 20 minutes, and went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in 2 weeks. The Archway working session was 6 hours, and it was exhausting, and by the end of it, the two finance teams had a unified methodology drafted, and both sides were tired enough to have stopped performing and started actually solving the problem, which was sometimes what it took. Paul Vance pulled her aside at the end of the session, in the hallway outside the conference suite. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had logged a lot of miles, and the kind of handshake that had always meant something. 6 weeks ago, I thought this deal was dead, he said. I know. What you did, but the speed of the response, the documentation, the board situation, I've watched a lot of executives handle crises. He looked at her levelly. You didn't let it define the narrative. You got ahead of it and controlled it. I had help, she said. The consultant? He'd seen Owen in the boardroom materials. Yes, Vance nodded. Good instinct bringing him in. Good instinct keeping him external. He extended his hand again, formally this time. We're going to close this deal, Sophia, and when we do, the combined entity is going to be something. She shook his hand. It already is, she said. That's why it's worth closing. He smiled, which was not something she'd seen him do before, and walked back toward his team. She texted Marcus. Session complete. Archways committed. Timeline by end of month. His reply came back in 30 seconds. Finally. And then, a moment later, good work. She pocketed the phone and walked to the elevator and stood inside it, alone, as it descended, and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not celebration exactly, but the specific gravity of a thing that had almost been lost and had been held. The elevator opened onto the lobby, and she walked out into the afternoon, and the city received her the way it always did, indifferently and completely, and she was fine with both. The weeks that followed had a quality she hadn't experienced in a long time, which was normalcy, not the absence of difficulty. There was still work, still pressure, still the daily machinery of running a company that was now in the final stretch of the largest transaction of its history. But the difficulty was proportionate, the kind that came with the territory rather than the kind that arrived from ambush, and that difference was more significant than it sounded. She and Owen settled into something that neither of them had formally named, which was by mutual unspoken agreement because naming things prematurely was a form of pressure neither of them wanted to apply. Saturdays in Eastgate when her schedule allowed. Dinners on occasional weeknights. Phone calls in the evenings when Lily was asleep, and they were both at the end of their separate days, and it was easier to talk than not to. She learned his rhythms. He learned hers. The learning was not always easy. He was more private than she'd initially thought, not in a guarded way, but in the way of someone who processed internally and only shared what had already been fully thought through, which sometimes frustrated her because she processed by talking and found silence where she'd expected dialogue. She told him this once, directly, because she was not someone who let useful information sit unspoken. I know, he said. I'm working on it. I'm not asking you to change it fundamentally, she said. I'm just naming that it's an adjustment. Noted, he said. And then, a moment later, what are you working on? That's an adjustment for me. She looked at him. What do you mean? You handle things while they're happening and debrief afterward, he said. I never know what's difficult until you've already resolved it. She thought about this. I don't want to put problems on people that aren't theirs to carry. I'm not people, he said. He stopped, selecting something. I'm someone who wants to know. She sat with that. Okay, she said. I'll try to be less resolved before I arrive. I'll try to be less internal before you ask." They looked at each other, and both of them found the arrangement somewhat absurd and completely acceptable, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was what people meant when they said compatible, which wasn't the same as effortless, which she had stopped believing in sometime in her mid-20s. Lily moved through the months like a weather system that was consistently interesting and occasionally unpredictable. She finished the pulley system, a functional apparatus attached to the door frame of her room that could raise and lower a small basket she'd designated for supplies, which in practice meant books and snacks and the occasional note she passed to herself for reasons she did not explain. She presented it to Sophia with the seriousness of an engineer presenting to stakeholders, which required Sophia to respond with equivalent seriousness, which she did. "Load capacity?" Sophia asked. Lily thought about this. "About 2 hardcover books and 1 granola bar. If I add the water bottle, it gets wobbly." "Structural limit." "I need better rope," Lily said. "The kind I have stretches. Dad said we'd look for the right kind." "Braided nylon doesn't stretch," Sophia said. "Low diameter, high tensile rating." Lily looked at her with the specific expression she wore when new information arrived that confirmed or expanded an existing theory. "Do you know about rope?" "I know a little about a lot of things," Sophia said. "Me too," Lily said, and nodded once, as if this settled something between them. She was not an easy child to get close to. Sophia had understood this from the first morning at Birchwood, and had respected it rather than trying to accelerate it. Lily's warmth, when it appeared, was not offered broadly. It arrived in specific forms, the information sharing that Sophia had learned to receive as a gesture of regard, the occasional question directed at Sophia specifically rather than at the general room, the Saturday 2 months in when Lily had sat beside her on the couch rather than across from her and pointed out the structural errors in the action movie they'd been watching with the focused satisfaction of a person who knew more than the screenplay. It was not uncomplicated, and it was not fast, and it was exactly what it needed to be. Owen watched it without comment most of the time, which she appreciated. Once, on a Saturday evening after Lily had gone to bed and they were in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner, an actual dinner that Sophia had cooked, pasta with a sauce that had taken 40 minutes and come out correctly because she'd followed the steps, he said, "She trusts you." Sophia was drying a pan. "Not entirely yet." "More than most people," he said. "She doesn't usually explain things to people. She just does them. She explains to you." Sophia thought about Lily and the rope and the bridge and the pulley system and the various small technical briefings that had occurred over the past 3 months. "It means a lot to me," she said simply. Owen was quiet, the way he was when something affected him more than he was going to immediately say. "I know it does," he said after a moment. "I can see it." She set the pan down and turned to look at him. He was at the sink, his back half turned to her, and she said, "Owen." He turned. She'd had a speech somewhere in her head, something about what this had become and what she wanted it to be, and the specific way the past months had rearranged things she'd believed about her own life. She'd composed it at odd moments. On the elevator, waiting for the Archway attorneys to join a call, at 3 a.m. when she should have been asleep. She had good words for it. She didn't use any of them. "I'm not going anywhere," she said instead. "I want you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through his face. Not surprise, but the particular response of a person for whom that sentence arrived with real weight, because not going anywhere was not a thing that had always been true about people, and he knew it, and so did she. "I know," he said, and then, "I'm not going anywhere either." They stood in his kitchen in Eastgate with the clean dishes between them, and the evening settled around the house, and it was not a dramatic moment by any standard measurement. But it was a true one, which she had come to understand was worth considerably more. The Archway merger closed on a Thursday in late October, 53 days after the corrected documentation package had gone to David Sue. Sophia signed the final documents at 2:15 in the afternoon in a conference room with 12 attorneys and 4 investment bankers, and Paul Vance across the table and Marcus Webb at her right shoulder. Eleanor Park had sent a handwritten note that morning that said simply, "Well done." Sophia had read it twice and put it in her desk drawer. The signing itself took 26 minutes because there were 31 documents and each required initialing in 3 places and signature in 2, which was as undramatic as the closing of a transaction that had nearly destroyed her was ever going to be, and she was fine with that. She was not someone who needed the closing to feel like the arrival. She had been arriving for 2 months. When it was done, Paul Vance shook her hand and said, "Welcome to the new landscape." She said, "Let's build something useful." And he said, "That's the plan." And that was the ceremony. She took Marcus to dinner that evening at a restaurant she'd been meaning to try for a year, and they ate well and talked about the integration timeline and the people she was going to keep and the structural questions the combined entity was going to have to answer over the next 12 months. Halfway through the main course, he put down his fork and said, "Are we going to talk about something other than the company?" She looked at him. "Probably not tonight." "Fair enough." He picked the fork back up. "Owen?" "He knows it closed. He sent a text this afternoon." "What did it say?" She thought about it. The text had been 4 words. "Go celebrate. You earned it." "That I earned it," she said. Marcus nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone assembling a picture from available pieces. "You're going to be okay, Sophia," he said. "All of it. Not just the company." She looked at him across the table. "You've worked for me for 5 years, and that's one of 3 personal things you've ever said to me." "I know," he said. "It's still true." She looked at her food and then at the restaurant around them, other people having other evenings, the normal commerce of a city at dinner on a Thursday in October, and thought that Marcus was right, and that she'd known it for a while, and that some knowledge took time to fully arrive at, even when you could see it coming. November moved differently. The merger integration began in earnest, and with it came the specific category of difficulty that followed consolidation. Redundant systems, misaligned cultures, people on both sides of the combined entity protecting their territory with the energy of the uncertain. Sophia had expected most of it. She hadn't expected the specific challenge of 2 very different company personalities trying to occupy the same organizational chart, Viridian's culture being leaner and more scrappy, Archway's being more formal and process-oriented, and the overlap being a place where nobody was comfortable yet. She handled it the way she handled most things, with more transparency than the situation seemed to call for, which was her consistent finding about most situations. She did an all-hands with the combined staff 2 weeks into integration and answered questions for 90 minutes, including questions about her own leadership, about Nathan Cole, about what had happened and what it meant for the company going forward. She'd been advised by 2 separate people to avoid the Nathan topic in a public forum. She'd ignored the advice because avoiding it would have made it larger, and she had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the best way to manage a narrative was to tell it yourself, accurately, before someone else told it less accurately. The all-hands went long and ended well. She walked out of it with the specific tiredness of someone who had been genuinely present for 90 minutes rather than performing presence, which were different in the way that mattered. Owen came to the city that evening with Lily, which had become an occasional thing. Sometimes the Saturday visits ran in the other direction, and Lily had opinions about certain restaurants near Sophia's apartment that she'd formed with the authority of someone who had eaten at 3 of them and extrapolated. Tonight she had selected the Italian place with the slow food, which had apparently been approved on a previous visit and retained status. They ordered. Lily took the menu seriously, as she always did, and asked the server a clarifying question about whether the pasta was made in-house, which the server confirmed with visible surprise at being asked by a 7-year-old. "She looked that up beforehand," Owen said to Sophia quietly. "I heard that," Lily said. "I know," Owen said. Sophia looked at the 2 of them and felt underneath the tiredness of the day something that was steady and warm and had been building for months. The food arrived and Lily ate with the focused satisfaction she brought to things she'd chosen deliberately, and the conversation moved as it did, practical, specific, occasionally sideways in the direction of something surprising. Lily described a disagreement she'd had with a classmate about the correct method for making a paper airplane, which had escalated to a controlled test and then to Lily's version of an olive branch, which was offering to explain the wing-to-body ratio because the other kid seemed genuinely interested, and that mattered more than winning. Owen looked at Sophia over the table, and she looked back at him, and they both understood, without saying it, that they were watching something they were both invested in. "Lily," Sophia said when there was a natural pause, "can I ask you something?" Lily looked up. "Yes?" When you built the bridge and you knew it was going to hold, how did you know? Like, what was the feeling inside knowing it?" Lily considered this with genuine seriousness. It was one of the things Sophia had come to find striking about her. She applied the same quality of attention to questions about feelings as she did to structural engineering, which was maybe less rare in children than adults, and more common in the ones who'd had to think hard about the world. "It felt like doing the math right," Lily said. "When the math is right, it's right. You don't have to wonder. And if you're not sure whether the math is right, then you check it again," Lily said simply. "And if you still can't tell, you build it and find out." Owen was very still across the table. Sophia looked at Lily for a moment and then said, "That's a good approach." "I know," Lily said, and went back to her pasta. Under the table, without making anything of it, Owen's hand found Sophia's and stayed there, and she turned her palm up and held on, and the restaurant went on around them in the ordinary way of evenings. And outside the city moved through its November dark, and none of the three people at the table said anything for a while, which was the most comfortable silence Sophia had sat inside in a very long time. She was at her desk on a Friday afternoon in late November, working through the last of the governance documents the board had requested after the investigation, when Eleanor Park called. "I want to raise something with you," Eleanor said, which was her way of saying she was going to say something that might be complicated to receive. Sophia had learned this about her. "Go ahead." "I've been thinking about the board composition. With the merger complete and the new organizational structure in place, I think we should discuss adding an independent seat. Someone with operational depth. Not finance, operations." Sophia understood immediately. "You're not asking me who I'd suggest." "I am, actually," Eleanor said. A pause. "That could be perceived as a conflict." "It could be. It would also be accurate." Eleanor paused. "He was the right person in the right room on the right day, and his read on what was happening inside the company, from outside it, was frankly better than what I was getting from people on the payroll." A beat. "I'm not asking because of your personal relationship, if that's what concerns you. I'm asking because the record is clear and the skill set is relevant." Sophia was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "I'd want it handled correctly," she said. "Full process, independent review of his background, no expedited track because of any relationship to me." "Of course. And I'd want to talk to him first." "Obviously," Eleanor said. "Think about it. That's all I'm asking." She hung up and sat for a moment, looking at the city outside, which was gray and moving toward dark in the early evening way of late November. She thought about Owen, who had walked into a boardroom for her because it was the right thing to do, and who had never once suggested he wanted anything from Viridian in return. She thought about what he'd do with the question when she asked it. She thought about Lily's answer at dinner, build it and find out. She picked up her phone and sent a text. "Are you free this weekend? Not a Saturday plan. I need to talk to you about something." His reply came back in a few minutes. "Sunday. Lily's at her grandmother's. Come to Eastgate." She typed, "Okay." She put the phone down and looked at the governance documents and worked until 7, which was earlier than usual, and went home through the November city and thought about the past 4 months, the highway, the park bench, the boardroom, the bridge, the kitchen, the hand under the table at the Italian restaurant, and thought about how none of it had been linear and all of it had been true, and that the two things being simultaneously accurate was something she was only recently old enough to appreciate. Sunday came gray and cold, the kind of late November day that committed fully to its bleakness and had a certain honesty in that. She drove to Eastgate and parked outside Owen's building and sat for a moment in the car, which she recognized as stalling and did anyway for exactly 30 seconds. Then she got out. He opened the door before she knocked, which meant he'd heard the car, and he looked at her. Coat, scarf, the expression she apparently wore when she was about to say something important, and stepped back to let her in. The house had the specific quality it got when Lily was absent, which was quieter in a way that was not emptiness but presence of different kind. She sat at the kitchen table where the pulley basket was visible through the doorway and the remains of Lily's current project were organized along the far counter. Wood pieces, clamps, a notebook open to a diagram. He made coffee without asking and set it in front of her and sat across from her and waited. "Eleanor called Friday," she said. "She wants to add an independent operational seat to the board." He was quiet. "She suggested you," Sophia said. "I want to be clear that I didn't suggest it, and I'm not lobbying for it. She came to the conclusion herself based on the record." Owen looked at her steadily. "What do you think?" "I think it would be handled correctly if done correctly," she said. "Full process, independent review, no shortcuts. And I think if you wanted it, the record supports it, and you'd be good at it." She paused. "I also want to be honest that it would be complicated, because of us, whatever us is, and I don't know whether complicated is the right thing to add right now." "You're asking me to make a decision based on what it does to something we haven't named yet," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, the way he was when something was being genuinely considered and not just processed. She waited because she had learned by now that waiting was what the silence asked for. "Can I say 2 things?" he said. "Please." "First, I appreciate that you told me exactly how it happened instead of a version that was easier." He looked at her. "You could have framed it differently. You didn't." "I told you I'd try to be less resolved before I arrived," she said. "You have been." He paused. "Second, what I want from the next part of my life is not something that fits cleanly into the question you just asked me. But what I know is that it involves you and Lily and work that means something, and it doesn't involve keeping things separate from each other because they look complicated on paper." She looked at him across his kitchen table in the November gray. "That's not a small thing you just said." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "Owen?" She stopped. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "I came here to ask you about a board seat, and what I actually want to say is that the past 4 months have been the most... I felt less alone in the past 4 months than I have in years, and I'm not good at saying that kind of thing without editing it first, and I'm not going to edit it because you asked me not to be resolved before I arrive." She looked at him directly. "That's what I came here to say. The board seat is secondary." He was very still. "You can say something," she said. "I know," he said. He stood up from the table, which surprised her, and walked around to her side of it, and she looked up at him. This man from a dark highway who drove an old truck and whose daughter checked the pasta boiling time. And he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something like that for 2 months. And the math is right," he said. "I'm sure of it." She stood up, which put her close enough to him that the kitchen felt different, and she said, "Lily's answer." "Her answer was better than mine was going to be," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she thought about stormy highways and broken suspensions and all the fragile, improbable connections that had to hold in order for 2 people to end up standing in the right kitchen on the right gray Sunday, and none of it was smooth, and all of it was real, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he put his forehead against hers, and they stood there in the gray November light, not saying anything more, because some things were past the point where words were the right tool. Outside, the city did what it always did. Inside, something that had been building for 4 months arrived at a place that felt simply like ground, solid and testable and worth standing on. The weeks after that Sunday in Eastgate had a different quality than anything that had come before them. And Sophia noticed the difference the way you noticed a change in air pressure. Not dramatically, not all at once, but as a persistent shift in the atmosphere of ordinary days. She had been, for most of her adult life, a person who lived in forward motion. The next quarter, the next deal, the next problem to outpace. She had built an entire professional identity around the idea that stopping was dangerous, that stillness was something you earned after the work was done, and that the work was never quite done. It had served her well. It had also cost her things she was only now fully accounting for. Evenings she didn't remember, weekends that dissolved into preparation for Monday, the slow accumulation of a life that was impressive on its metrics and thinner than it should have been everywhere else. What she found in the months following November was that she was still herself, still driven, still meticulous, still the first one in the building most mornings. But there was something on the other side of the day now that she moved toward rather than away from, and the having of it changed the shape of the work without diminishing any of it. She was, if anything, better at her job, clearer in her priorities, less likely to spend energy on things that didn't deserve it. She had heard people say this about love before and had filed it as wishful thinking, the kind of thing people told themselves to justify the time. She understood now that it wasn't that. It was simpler. When you knew what you were working for, the work made more sense. Owen joined the Viridian board in February, following a full independent review process that took 6 weeks and turned up nothing that wasn't already part of the public record of his professional history. Eleanor Park handled the announcement with the specific understatement she applied to things she considered self-evident, describing him to the full board as someone with a demonstrated ability to see clearly under pressure. Nobody who had been in the boardroom that September could argue with it. There were, predictably, questions about the nature of his relationship with the CEO. Sophia answered them directly, in the board context, which was the right context. "We're together," she said. "That's disclosed and on record. The board can evaluate whether the governance structure accommodates that appropriately. My position is that it does, given that his seat is non-executive, and the standard conflict protocols apply." She looked around the table. "If anyone has a substantive concern about governance, I'd rather hear it now than sideways." Nobody offered a substantive concern. Eleanor, in the private conversation afterward, said only, "Well handled," and moved on to the next agenda item, which was how Eleanor Park communicated approval and always had been. Owen, for his part, moved into the board role with the same quality he brought to everything. Without inflation, without performance, with enough preparation that his first substantive contribution came in his second meeting and was the kind of observation that made two people in the room look at each other and then back at him. He had, Sophia had long since understood, an ability to see the shape of a problem from the outside that was genuinely rare, the kind of perspective that came not from genius but from having stood at multiple angles to failure and learned what each view revealed. He also, in that same second meeting, disagreed with her. It was on the integration pace. She had proposed an accelerated timeline for the systems consolidation, and he thought it was too fast and said so, directly, in front of the full board, with 3 specific reasons that were all correct. She pushed back on one of them, accepted the other 2, and the meeting moved on. In the car afterward, they were driving to Eastgate together because it was a Thursday, and Thursday had become, organically, the night she usually stayed. She said, "You were right about the server migration timeline." "I know," he said. "You didn't have to be so right in front of everyone." He glanced at her sideways. "Do you actually mean that?" She looked at the road. "No," she said. "I mean the opposite. I needed someone in that room who would do that." "You have Marcus." "Marcus defers to me eventually. You don't." "That's why it works," he said simply, and she didn't argue because he was correct. Lily turned 8 in March. She had specific ideas about her birthday, which was consistent with her approach to most things, and the specific idea she had about this one was that she wanted to cook the dinner herself. Not be helped with dinner, not supervised dinner. Cook it herself, with everyone else out of the kitchen. Owen had negotiated partial supervision rights on the grounds that the stove was involved, and she was 8. Lily had accepted partial supervision rights under protest, and with the condition that he stand by the door and not offer opinions unless asked. Sophia arrived at 6 to a kitchen that smelled like garlic and effort and the specific burnt edge quality of something that had gone slightly wrong and been corrected. Lily was standing at the stove in an apron that was too big for her, hair pulled back, looking at a pan of sauce with the focused evaluation of someone deciding whether an outcome was acceptable. "How is it?" Sophia asked from the doorway. Lily turned. "The onions got too brown," she said. "I had the heat wrong at the beginning. But I added the tomatoes before it got bad, so the sauce is fine. The brown parts dissolved." "That's actually a technique," Sophia said. "If you brown the onions past translucent, the sugars caramelize. Adds depth." Lily turned back to the pan and stirred it once. "So it's better than it would have been?" "Might be," Sophia said. "You won't know until you taste it." Lily tasted it with the back of a spoon and was still for a moment in the assessing way. "It's okay," she said, which from Lily was the equivalent of most people saying it was excellent. Owen appeared beside Sophia in the doorway. "Am I allowed in yet?" "No," Lily said. 5 more minutes. He stepped back out. Sophia moved to follow, and Lily said, "You can stay." Sophia stayed. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched Lily finish the sauce and start the pasta water, and manage both simultaneously with the calm concentration of someone who had practiced and knew it and found that knowledge satisfying. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's name and her father's way of doing things, and something entirely her own that didn't belong to either of them. And she stood in her too big apron with the wooden spoon and was, Sophia thought, one of the most complete people she had ever met at any age. "Sophia," Lily said, without turning around. "Yeah." "Are you going to stay? Like, permanently?" The question arrived without preamble or ceremony, the way Lily's questions always arrived, and Sophia understood that it had been considered carefully and held for a long time before being offered, and that the offering was itself a significant thing. "That depends on a few people being okay with it," Sophia said. Lily stirred the sauce. "I'm asking because I'm okay with it," she said. "I wanted you to know that." The kitchen was very quiet. "Thank you, Lily," Sophia said, and the words were simple and accurate and nowhere near sufficient, and somehow exactly right. "The pasta's going in," Lily announced, and the moment moved into the practical business of dinner, and Sophia stood in the kitchen on a March evening and felt the specific weight of being received by someone who did not receive people easily, and understood that it was one of the most significant things that had ever happened to her. Owen proposed in June. Not at dinner, not in a restaurant, not in any setting that had been prepared or arranged for the purpose. It happened on a Tuesday evening at Sophia's apartment, which had become as much his space as hers over the months. His coffee thermos on her counter, a collection of Lily's drawings on her refrigerator held up with the magnets Lily had selected specifically for the purpose. The foam dinosaur from the truck's dashboard relocated, without explanation, to Sophia's windowsill where it had been for 4 months. They were washing dishes after a dinner that hadn't been planned as anything. Takeout from the place 2 streets over, eaten at the kitchen island because neither of them had felt like setting the table. The conversation moving through the day's various events without agenda. Lily was staying at Owen's mother's that night, which was a standing Tuesday arrangement that gave Owen what he'd once called the quiet house, and Sophia had come to think of as the space where they were most themselves with each other, without the performance of being in front of anyone. He handed her a glass to dry and then didn't move away, and she looked up at him, and something in his expression was different from its usual steadiness. Not nervous exactly, but present in a way that was more concentrated than ordinary. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Okay." He put down the dish he was holding, which was unlike him because he finished things. He looked at her. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I thought I might have one by now, and I don't." She set down the glass. "I know what I want," he said. "I've known it for a while. I want you in this, all the way. I want Lily to have what she said she wanted in the kitchen on her birthday. I want to build something that isn't a company and isn't a project and has a different kind of staying power than either of those." He paused. "I'm not good at the decorative version of this." "I know," she said. "That's not what I want." He reached into his pocket, not a production, just a man reaching into his pocket, and held out a ring that was not elaborate, that was a single clean stone in a setting that had chosen proportion over statement, and it was exactly right in the way that things were right when someone had paid attention rather than tried hard. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you want that too." She looked at the ring and then at him and thought about a stormy highway and a foam dinosaur and a backup index and a bridge made of balsa wood and a kitchen full of someone else's pasta and the math being right and build it and find out and all the improbable sequence of things that had arranged themselves into this Tuesday evening at her kitchen sink. She also thought about Cora, who had been real and had been loved and was not replaced by any of this but was present in Lily and in Owen's particular quality of knowing what mattered and not wasting time on what didn't, and she thought that honoring that was part of what she was choosing. "Yes," she said. It was the only word she had, and it was the complete answer. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment and then at him, and he held her face in his hands the way he did when he meant to be fully present, and neither of them said anything for a while because the occasion had already said what it needed to. They told Lily the next morning. Owen drove to his mother's to get her and brought her back to Sophia's apartment, and Lily came in with her backpack still on and looked at the two of them standing in the kitchen, and then at Sophia's hand, and then back at her father. "Is that what I think it is?" she said. "Yes," Owen said. Lily looked at Sophia. "You said yes?" "I said yes," Sophia said. Lily put down her backpack with the careful deliberateness of someone who was managing their reaction and not ready to be observed managing it. She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that Sophia's chest tightened. Then Lily crossed the kitchen and hugged Sophia, which she had done before, but not like this. Not with both arms and her whole small self and the specific quality of something that had been decided and was now being expressed. Sophia held on, one hand on the back of Lily's head, and looked at Owen over her, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was beyond the reach of the controlled expression, and the real thing was visible underneath, and she thought that whatever the tab had been and however long it had run, this was the settlement, this was the equalization, and it was worth everything that had preceded it. "Okay," Lily said, pulling back and composing herself with the dignity she always recovered quickly. "When?" "We haven't decided yet," Owen said. "You should do it in the fall," Lily said. "Summer is too hot, and winter is slippery." "Fall it is," Sophia said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to look in the refrigerator. The wedding was in October, which satisfied Lily's meteorological requirements and which turned out to be exactly right for other reasons too. The light that month had a quality that belonged specifically to that season, low and warm, the kind of October afternoon that knew it was brief and delivered itself completely because of it. It was small. Sophia had been to large weddings and had found the scale oppressive in a way she'd never fully articulated, the performance of the thing overwhelming the substance of it. What she wanted was the people who had actually been present for the story, and the list of those people was shorter than a wedding planner would have preferred, and exactly correct. Marcus Webb was there, with his wife, who turned out to have strong opinions about floral arrangements that Sophia found genuinely useful. Eleanor Park came, alone, and stood at the edge of the ceremony with the expression of someone who found the proceedings appropriate and was not going to make a scene about being moved by them, which Sophia respected completely. Owen's mother sat in the front row with the specific quality of a woman who had watched her son carry something heavy for a long time and was now watching him put it down, and her face through the ceremony was something Sophia would not forget. Lily wore a blue dress she had chosen herself after a 2-week consideration process, and carried a small bouquet she had arranged with the same methodology she brought to structural projects. She stood beside her father at the ceremony and then beside Sophia, moving between them with the ease of someone navigating between two things that were already one thing. The ceremony was outside, in a garden attached to a house Owen's family had used for occasions for years. Not grand, not designed for events, just a space that had been used for the right things long enough to hold some quality of that use in its arrangement. There was no rehearsed script beyond the essential commitments, because neither of them had wanted to perform something they could simply mean. The officiant, a woman named Claire who had known Owen for 15 years, said something in her remarks that Sophia had not expected, and that arrived with more force than anything else that afternoon. She said, "What I know about Owen is that he has always known the difference between what looks good and what holds, and I think you know that about each other, which means what you're building today is not a beautiful object. It's a structure, and the best structures are not the ones that never face weight. They're the ones that were built knowing they would." Lily, who had been standing straight and composed throughout the ceremony, looked up at Sophia at that moment with an expression that was 8 years old and 40 years old at the same time, and Sophia looked back at her and understood that the three of them had been building this structure for a year, and that it had already been tested, and that it had held. She and Owen said what they meant to each other in words that were not perfect. His got interrupted by a catch in his voice that he pushed through without apology, and hers ran slightly longer than she'd intended because she had edited them 3 times and still hadn't gotten them to the right length, and she had decided that morning to say them anyway. Neither of them cried, though Owen came close, and Lily definitely did not cry, and was very clear afterward that the thing in her eye had been the wind. They were married at 4:17 in the afternoon on the second Saturday of October, and the afternoon light was exactly what October afternoons in that part of the world were capable of when they tried, and it was not perfect, and it was completely right, and it held. life after the wedding was not transformed. It was continuous, the same life, but with a different shape, the way a river is the same river after it joins with another, and also permanently changed. Sophia continued to lead Viridian, which was in its second year as a merged entity, and finding its integrated identity in the slow, sometimes contentious way of organizations that had genuinely different histories. The work was harder than the pre-merger work in some ways, and richer in others. She was better at it than she had been at 30, which was not what everyone told you to expect from your 30s, but which she intended to continue being true about her 40s. Owen's place on the board stabilized into exactly what Eleanor had predicted, the voice in the room that had no stake in the outcome except the right one, which was the most valuable thing a board could have and the hardest thing to engineer. He still ran his consulting practice, scaled back from where it had been but not abandoned, because the work still meant something to him and because he had learned, the hard way, that what you did with your hands and mind when it was just you and a problem was not something to trade away for a title. He also, that spring, launched something he had been thinking about for longer than he'd admitted to most people, including himself. It was a mentorship foundation, small, by design, focused specifically on entrepreneurs who were single parents navigating the specific difficulty of building something while raising someone. The combination of obligations that nobody in a business school had told him was the hardest thing he would ever manage. He called it what it was and didn't dress it up. The Heart Foundation, which Lily thought was an acceptable name and had offered to design the logo for, which she did, and which was, it turned out, both structurally sound and genuinely good. He had told Sophia about the foundation one evening before the wedding, laid out in the plain way he laid out things he cared about. Not the pitch version, not the polished case, just what it was and why it mattered and what he thought it could do. She had listened all the way through and then said, "What do you need?" And he had told her, and she had helped where it made sense and stayed out of it where it didn't because she knew by now that the difference between support and encroachment was one of the things worth understanding precisely. The Foundation's first cohort of mentees was 12 people. The second, a year later, was 26. But Nathan Cole's case resolved in the spring following the wedding. The state attorney's investigation confirmed the competitive contact with Corten Analytics. 2 meetings, 1 documented transfer of proprietary information about Viridian's pending patent filing. The charges that followed were not minor. His attorney negotiated, and what he received was not nothing. A settlement that included a substantial financial penalty, a 5-year bar from serving in executive or fiduciary roles in any technology company, and a formal judgment that would follow him wherever his professional record went. Sophia was not present for the resolution. She received a call from the investigating attorney with the outcome, and she said, "Understood, thank you," and ended the call and went back to the quarterly review she had been preparing for. She had thought, at various points over the preceding year, about what she would feel when this part ended. What she actually felt was the specific absence of weight that came when something you had been carrying for a long time was finally set down. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet relief of closure. She told Owen that evening. He listened and said, "How do you feel?" "Done," she said. "I feel done with it." "Good," he said. Richard Falconer had, in the intervening year, reduced his fund's stake in Viridian to a minority position and had been largely absent from board interactions. Sophia suspected this would eventually become a full exit and was prepared for it with equanimity. He had made a calculation based on available information, and the calculation had been wrong, and he was now navigating the professional cost of that. She did not have excess energy for anything beyond professional neutrality toward him, and did not pretend otherwise. What she had come to understand about betrayal, the large kind, the sustained deliberate kind that Nathan had practiced, was that it didn't actually change the calculus of trust in the way she had initially feared it would. She had worried, in those first weeks after the boardroom, that what had happened would make her smaller in her willingness to rely on people, that she would carry Nathan as a permanent argument against openness. What she found instead was that it had sharpened her rather than closed her, made her more accurate rather than more defended. She knew better now what to look for and what to look past, and the knowing was not armor but precision, which was a different thing entirely. She had told a group of young executives at an industry forum, the spring after the wedding, something she hadn't planned to say but which surfaced because the question that was asked deserved a true answer rather than a polished one. Someone in the audience asked how you rebuilt institutional trust after a significant internal betrayal, and she had said, "You don't rebuild it. You build something new with better materials and a better understanding of what the original design got wrong. The mistake is thinking trust is a structure you restore. It's a structure you keep building. The moment you think it's finished is the moment it starts failing." The room had been quiet in the way that sometimes meant people were writing something down. She'd meant every word. Lily turned 9 that March, 10 the one after, and kept building things. She moved from the pulley system to a more ambitious project, a model of a suspension bridge that occupied the dining table for 3 weekends and required more research than most middle school students applied to assigned homework. She presented her findings on cable tension to Owen and Sophia with a whiteboard she had acquired specifically for the purpose and used with the confidence of someone who had already answered her own questions and was now sharing conclusions rather than seeking approval. "The cables don't pull up," she explained, moving the marker with purpose. "They pull out. The towers push down and the anchorages hold the cables from the sides. The deck hangs from the cables. The whole thing is a balance of tension and compression. Remove one and the other has nothing to work against." Owen, who had heard variations of this 3 times during the research phase and had learned to receive each iteration as complete in itself, said, "What happens if one anchorage fails?" Lily looked at the diagram. The cable goes slack on that side. The deck tilts. The towers become unbalanced. Eventually, the whole span fails. She paused. "The anchorages matter more than the towers. Everybody looks at the towers." Sophia looked at the diagram and thought about companies and people and the specific invisible supports that mattered more than the visible impressive things, and thought that Lily had arrived at something true about more than bridges. "You should be an engineer," she said. Lily considered this seriously. "Maybe," she said, "or I might do something else. I want to know how things work first and then decide what to do with it." She looked at Sophia with the direct gaze she'd had since the beginning. "You know how companies work. Dad knows how they fail. That's different kinds of knowing." "It is," Sophia agreed. "I want both kinds," Lily said, and turned back to her whiteboard. Owen caught Sophia's eye over Lily's head, and she saw in his face what she had come to know as his version of "I told you she'd be okay." That specific warmth that arrived without performance and stayed as long as it was true. She looked back at her daughter. The word had arrived in her thinking sometime in the fall and had stayed without fanfare, because that was how the right things arrived, not with announcement, but with the quiet authority of the accurate, and thought about what it meant to be trusted by someone who did not give it freely, and what it cost, and what it was worth. It was worth more than she had words for. That was fine. Some things were larger than their description, and you carried them whole rather than reduced. There was a moment, sometime in the 2nd year after the wedding, that Sophia returned to in the years that followed when she thought about what it meant for a life to go right. It was an ordinary evening in October, the anniversary month, and the 3 of them were in the Eastgate house. She thought of it as her house now too, which had happened gradually and then completely, the way most of the real things had happened. Lily was at the kitchen table working on something. Owen was reading, legs stretched out, in the chair that had absorbed his particular shape over the years. Sophia was on the couch with her laptop, working through a document that required attention and was receiving it. None of them were talking. The television was off. Outside, the October evening was doing what October evenings did, and the house held the specific quality of a space that had been used for something good long enough that the goodness was in the walls. Lily looked up from her work and said, to nobody in particular, "This is nice." Neither Owen nor Sophia said anything immediately. Then Owen said, "Yeah." Lily went back to her work. Sophia looked at the screen of her laptop and then at the room around her. At the foam dinosaur on the windowsill, at Lily's drawings on the refrigerator, at Owen's reading posture, at the whole ordinary and unrepeatable arrangement of the evening, and understood, with the particular clarity that didn't require drama or ceremony or the presence of anything exceptional, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had built a company from nothing. She had defended it from someone who tried to take it from the inside. She had found, on a dark highway in the rain, the beginning of something she hadn't known she was looking for. She had sat in a boardroom and watched the truth do what truth does when it's properly documented and clearly presented. She had learned that the people who change your life most arrive without announcement, that they show up as foam dinosaurs and cold coffee and a 7-year-old who trusts triangles, and that you can't prepare for them and can't earn them and can only be present enough to receive them when they come. She had learned that partnership was not what you had when everything was working. It was what you had when things weren't working, and the two of you stayed at the problem together anyway. She had learned this from Owen, who had taught it without intending to, by simply being the version of himself he had worked hard to become and not presenting any other version for approval. She had learned from Lily that the question of whether something holds is not answered by looking at it. You find out when weight is applied, and that the right response to uncertainty is not to build lighter, it's to build better. She had been building better. The document on her laptop waited. She finished the paragraph she'd been working on, closed it, and set the laptop on the cushion beside her. Lily looked up. Done? For tonight, Lily nodded. I made something today in math that I want to show you. It's about how probability works when you don't know all the variables. Show me, Sophia said, and Lily brought her notebook to the couch and sat beside Sophia and explained, with her characteristic precision and the specific warmth she showed to people she had decided were worth explaining things to. And outside the October evening settled into night, and the house held what it held, and it was not perfect, and it was not finished, and it was everything.